It was the fall of 1181, or at least that's what the scribes would later write down. I want you to slow down for a second and see what I saw. I was standing there with no more than 400 worn-out knights, men who hadn't slept properly in days. My horse was shaking beneath me, foam dripping from its mouth after a forced march that should have broken both man and beast. The sun shouldn't have been this cruel so late in the season, yet it burned down from a cloudless sky, turning steel armor into an oven you couldn't escape. Then the scouts came back. You could tell by their faces before they ever spoke. Hardened men, veterans, and still, some of them were fighting back tears. We hadn't miscalculated by a little. We had been wrong by everything. Not 15,000 enemies like we'd feared, but nearly 30,000, the finest warriors the Islamic world could field, stretching across the land until the horizon itself looked dark and alive. Do the math with me. That meant more than 70 enemies for every one of us. The numbers were merciless, cold, final. By all logic, by every rule of war, this should have been the end of us. And yet, before the sun finished its arc, tens of thousands of those warriors would lie dead, and an army believed to be unstoppable would simply vanish from history. What made it even harder to grasp was this. The man who would make it happen was barely more than a boy. A sick teenager, hands wrapped in cloth because his fingers no longer obeyed him, was about to do what seasoned generals said couldn't be done, what strategy books insisted was impossible, what even heaven itself seemed to forbid. Think about it again. 400 against nearly 30,000. The future of Christian rule in the Holy Land, maybe even beyond it, was hanging by something thinner than a thread. You couldn't see it. You could only feel it. And by nightfall, that fragile strand would harden into iron. There are 3 truths from that day that forever changed how I understand medieval war. First, a catastrophic mistake made by the enemy commander that no one expected. Second, the reason elite mounted warriors, men who had never fled a battlefield, would turn and run in terror. And third, the moment when a dying king, who couldn't even feel his own hands, lifted a sword he shouldn't have been able to hold, and bent history itself. But here's what the chronicles leave out. That morning, our king wasn't supposed to be alive, let alone leading an army. The disease had been eating him since childhood, slow and merciless. By the time he was 17, his hands were so damaged they had to be wrapped in fine cloth just to keep the skin from tearing. His face stayed hidden behind a polished mask, not for ceremony, but because the damage beneath it was more than most people could bear to see. Court officials avoided his gaze. Some couldn't even stand in the same room. Doctors had already pronounced him finished years earlier. Every sunrise he saw after that was a contradiction of medicine itself. Every time he climbed onto a horse was an act of sheer defiance against his own failing body. And standing opposite him was one of the most powerful men alive. The great Muslim commander, revered, feared, almost mythic, had unified fractured lands through discipline, intelligence, and faith. In his early 40s, he ruled territory that stretched across rivers and deserts, backed by wealth drawn from the richest cities of the age. His armies had shattered every Christian force that challenged them. Entire fortresses surrendered at the sound of his name alone. While our king fought his own decaying flesh every single day, his enemy commanded well over 100,000 soldiers spread across his dominions. This wasn't just an uneven fight. It was absurd. Even Jerusalem knew it. Ships sat ready in nearby ports, packed with the belongings of nobles already planning their escape. Quiet talks were happening behind closed doors, negotiating surrender before swords ever met. Most believed the kingdom had days, maybe weeks, left at best. Across all Christian lands combined, we might have gathered 12,000 men if every garrison was stripped bare. And the force marching toward us now, this one army alone, outnumbered that, and it wasn't even the enemy's main host. By every rational measure, we were already finished. That's what the situation really looked like that cold morning. When the sun came up, our king could barely assemble about 450 knights, and among them, only 70 brothers of the temple. Those men weren't ordinary soldiers. They were warrior monks bound by vows that left no room for retreat, no space for surrender, and no mercy for enemies who threatened the kingdom. Behind them stood not even 2,500 foot soldiers, most of them locals pulled from farms and workshops. Many carried spears that had once been tools, shields patched together from scraps, and courage that came not from training but from desperation. Facing us was something else entirely. The enemy had brought nearly 9,000 elite mounted warriors, men taken young, broken down, and rebuilt into living weapons. They had trained for war since childhood. Killing wasn't something they learned. It was something they were shaped for. As late autumn slid toward winter that year, reports arrived that forced our dying king into a choice no sane commander would ever make. Inside the throne room of Jerusalem, the War Council had stopped being a discussion and turned into controlled terror. Voices overlapped. Tempers flared. Fear hung in the air thicker than incense. When the king arrived, he wasn't walking. He had to be carried on a litter, his legs no longer capable of holding even his frail weight. The chill in the chamber should have eased his suffering. Instead, it sent waves of pain through nerves already destroyed by disease. Every man in that room knew what the scouts had confirmed beyond doubt. The enemy host, more than 25,000 strong, was moving north from the coast, deliberately ignoring fortified cities, marching straight toward Jerusalem itself. The city's defenses were a cruel joke. Fewer than 800 men remained in the garrison. Most were too old to fight, too young to matter, or too wounded to stand. The numbers weren't just bad. They were lethal. Finally, someone said what everyone else was too afraid to voice. The seasoned commander of Tripoli broke the silence. "My lord," he said carefully, "you must withdraw to the coast. The kingdom needs a living king, not a heroic corpse." Others followed. One suggested negotiations. Perhaps surrender could still be arranged. Even the most aggressive noble among us, a man who had never once argued against battle, said nothing at all. That's how dire it was. Then the king did something none of us expected. Despite hands that barely obeyed him, despite a body that screamed with every movement, he demanded to be raised upright. The attendants hesitated. He insisted. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, clear, and carried to every corner of that stone hall. "I may die tomorrow," he said, "or I may die years from now. But I will die the way I have lived, defending this kingdom. God did not give me this suffering without purpose, and if we are granted victory, no man will dare say it came from human strength alone." For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then someone laughed, nervously. Victory? Some wondered aloud if the illness had finally reached his mind. But the commander of the temple understood. His brothers had sworn to die rather than retreat. If a dying young king could face annihilation with faith, how could they do any less? Slowly, deliberately, the knights began to kneel, not in obedience, but in belief. What followed shattered every rule of warfare. Instead of ordering the walls reinforced, instead of preparing for siege, the king gave a command that stunned us all. We would march, immediately. Not away from the enemy, but straight toward them. Within the hour, every man who could grip a weapon was ordered to move. It was madness. Marching exhausted troops nearly 40 miles through hostile land to strike an army that outnumbered us more than 50 to 1 defied logic. Historians still struggle to explain what came next. That march should have killed us. Nearly 2 days on the road, men encased in iron who hadn't rested in weeks, horses driven past reason. Heat that didn't belong to that season turned the road into an anvil. After 10 hours, men began collapsing. By 20, some spoke to things that weren't there. The knights took turns carrying the king when pain dragged him into unconsciousness, which happened often. Blood soaked through his wrappings where wounds refused to close. Near a small village along the route, witnesses later swore his body convulsed so violently that several men had to hold him down to keep him from falling from the litter. And yet, whenever he came back to himself, His words never changed. Keep moving. Every time the pain dragged him back from unconsciousness, his first words never changed. Keep moving. No hesitation. No doubt. While we were grinding ourselves into the dust on that road, our enemy was making the mistake that would destroy him. He was too confident, completely certain that numbers alone had already won the war. Believing there was no possible way a dying king would abandon the safety of stone walls, he allowed his army to loosen its grip on discipline. The host spread out across the countryside for miles. Units broke formation. Men wandered off to forage. Guards relaxed. Order dissolved into comfort. His scouts had told him Jerusalem was barely defended. Why stay tight and ready when you're marching toward what you believe is an execution? His commanders were already arguing over land that hadn't even been taken yet. Who would claim the richest estates? Who would rule which towns? The Sultan himself brought along his full treasury, not for battle, but to finance occupation. By the time dawn broke a few days later, our march had covered distances that maps insisted were impossible in that time. Men who should have been dead were still standing. Horses that should have collapsed were still moving. Then the scouts returned. The news hit us like lightning. The enemy army wasn't formed for war. They weren't braced. They weren't ready. They were scattered, loose, careless. It felt as if heaven itself had laid them bare exactly as our king had foretold. The morning came up clear and already warm, the kind of heat that shouldn't exist that late in the year. And somewhere in that rising sun, a single mistake was made, one that would cost tens of thousands of lives. Just after sunrise, our scouts came racing back. These were local men, riders who knew every hill and dry stream bed like their own hands. Even the most exhausted knights straightened when they heard the report. The enemy wasn't drawn up for battle. Their camp stretched across rolling land for miles. Supply wagons stood unguarded. Horse lines were scattered. From a distance, it looked less like an army and more like a wandering people on the move. One of the commanders of the temple rode hard to the king's litter. "My lord," he said, voice tight with awe, "they are in our hands." Then he paused. "But the numbers are worse than we believed. Not 20,000, closer to 30. Their banners fill the horizon." Some men wept openly. Others dropped to their knees and prayed. The odds had shifted from impossible to unthinkable. Late in the morning, the enemy finally noticed something was wrong. Dust clouds rose in the distance, fast, deliberate, advancing. When the first report reached their commander, he dismissed it. His scouts had confirmed the city was barely defended. The king wouldn't dare leave its protection. It had to be a raiding party, a distraction. He sent a handful of units to investigate. Nothing more. That decision would follow him for the rest of his life. By midday, the truth could no longer be denied. Banners appeared on the ridgeline. Not scouts, not skirmishers, but full war standards. The deep red cross of the temple, the bright gold of Jerusalem. And there, unmistakable, the personal banner of our king himself. Panic rippled through the enemy camp. Officers shouted orders in 3 languages at once. Units collided trying to reform. But when an army is spread across miles, time becomes your enemy, and we gave them none. Every rule of war said we should wait. Let them gather, let them form ranks. Then withdraw to defensible ground. Draw them into terrain we could hold. Every manual, every lesson passed down from ancient battles warned against attacking superior numbers in open land. Our king ignored every single one. Despite agony that would have broken most men, he demanded to be lifted from the litter and set onto his horse. Knights rushed to secure him, strapping his failing body to the saddle. His legs were useless. His hands barely obeyed him. Blood seeped through cloth where leather straps cut into diseased flesh. And still, he stayed upright. Still, he rode forward. When he finally spoke, his voice carried farther than it had any right to. It rolled down the line, cut through fear, and settled into every man's chest. "Brothers," he said, David faced a giant with faith alone. Today, we face an army with God beside us. What happened on the enemy side told us everything we needed to know. Their elite cavalry, men who had stared down armored Byzantine lancers and African horsemen without blinking, simply froze. For a handful of heartbeats, they couldn't understand what they were seeing. A few hundred knights forming for a full charge against an army that dwarfed them wasn't tactics. It was suicide. From his command position, the enemy leader dropped the heavy mace he was holding. I saw it fall, glint once in the sun, and disappear into the dust. The greatest commander of the age stood there, staring, unable to process the madness unfolding in front of him. That's when our king saw something the other side hadn't. What looked like an open plain wasn't open at all. The ground was cut through with shallow ravines and dry channels, invisible at a distance but deadly to anyone trying to flee at speed. Flat land to the eye, but a trap to those who ran. The young king understood it instantly. The seasoned general across from him did not. Those gullies would become corridors of death. "Madness," the enemy commander muttered, before shouting to his officers. "Form ranks! Form ranks!" But you can't snap an army back into shape when it's scattered across miles of farmland. That takes time. And time was the one thing we weren't going to give them. In the early afternoon, the signal came. The king raised his wrapped hand. That was it. Every knight knew what it meant. Lances dropped as one, points leveling toward the horizon. In that single motion, hesitation vanished. Then we moved. The charge hit like the strike of a divine hammer. The wedge of the temple, less than 100 riders shaped into a living spear, slammed into the enemy's half-formed center at full gallop. The sound was unbelievable, like stone cliffs collapsing into each other. Men miles away would later swear they heard it. In the first moments, hundreds of enemy riders were simply erased, trampled under iron-shod hooves, punched clean through by long ash lances that tore through armor and flesh as if neither mattered. But the real shock wasn't the impact. It was that the temple knights didn't break off. Every doctrine said they should wheel away, regroup, strike again. They ignored it all. They kept driving forward, deeper and deeper, like a blade forcing its way toward a heart. Right behind them, the rest of our mounted knights crashed in, widening the breach the monks had torn open. In less than a minute, the charge had crossed hundreds of yards, 500 armored horsemen moving like a single landslide. Our battle cry drowned out shouted orders and screamed commands. It swallowed everything. Arrows began falling before we were halfway there. Men dropped, horses screamed and went down hard, but no one slowed. No one broke. When we closed further, the fear finally reached the enemy front ranks. These weren't just soldiers charging them. These were men who believed dying in that moment meant eternity. And the temple knights, black and white banners snapping overhead, looked less like warriors and more like something pulled straight from nightmare. Then the impossible happened. The enemy's center, thousands of their finest cavalry, didn't retreat. It bent, like a dam beginning to crack. Their commanders stared in disbelief. The numbers didn't work. The weight didn't make sense. Exhausted horses shouldn't have been pushing fresh ones back. Worn men shouldn't have been breaking professionals. And yet, they were. And then something else happened. Something no rule of war could explain. Our horses, driven past exhaustion by days of marching, should have been failing. Instead, they fought like beasts possessed. They should have been collapsing under us. Instead, our horses turned into something feral. War mounts snapped with their teeth, struck with iron-shod hooves, kicked and crushed anything that came too close. They weren't just carrying us anymore. They were fighting beside us. I watched one temple horse charge on without its rider, the man already dead somewhere behind it. The animal plowed straight through enemy ranks, trampling men, spreading terror simply by refusing to stop. Arrow after arrow slammed into its body. I counted later, more than a dozen shafts jutting from its flank before it finally collapsed. But by then, An entire enemy unit had already broken and fled. That was the moment panic found its voice. On the enemy's left, a mounted regiment saw the center bending and began to drift backward. Not a retreat, just a hesitation. And in battle, hesitation spreads faster than fire. Within moments, that drift turned into movement. Movement turned into flight. Orders became screams. Discipline dissolved into raw survival. The impossible was unfolding in front of us. An army many times our size was coming apart. Then came the king's final stroke. While the cavalry smashed forward, thousands of our foot soldiers, hidden in low ground and folds of terrain, suddenly rose and appeared on the enemy flank. To men already shaken, it looked like new armies were materializing out of the earth itself. Cries of, "We are surrounded," tore through their ranks. It didn't matter that it wasn't true. Fear doesn't do arithmetic. The king himself, strapped to the saddle, blood leaking from wounds reopened by strain, lifted his sword. That motion should have been impossible. His hands shouldn't have been able to close around the hilt. And yet every account, from friend and enemy alike, records the same thing. He raised it. He led from the front. As we closed the distance, I saw enemy horses balk and rear, refusing commands. Animals sense what men try to deny. They felt the end coming. The ground shook beneath tens of thousands of hooves. Dust rose like smoke from a burning city. The noise defies description. Thunder mixed with screaming steel, prayers shouted to different heavens, weapons clashing and turning red. Arrows blackened the sky. Still, we came on. Unstoppable, inevitable, terrifying. Then battle tipped into slaughter. As the enemy tried to flee, they ran straight into the trap our king had seen hours earlier. Those shallow ravines that looked like escape routes swallowed men and horses alike. Knights drove fleeing riders straight into them, turning natural channels into pits of death. And then, something even enemy historians would later call divine judgment. Late in the afternoon, the unthinkable happened. The Sultan's personal guard broke. These were men sworn to die before abandoning their lord. Veterans who had faced the fiercest horsemen of the East without fear, warriors who wore scars like sacred marks. And they ran. The sight shattered what little resolve remained. If the elite guard fled, what chance did anyone else have? From his vantage point, watching his army disintegrate, the enemy commander made a choice that would stain his legacy forever. He abandoned his warhorse, too slow now, and escaped on a fast camel. When his men saw it, something inside them collapsed completely. Their leader, fleeing on a pack animal, ended the fight. What followed wasn't battle. It was annihilation. We pursued for miles. Broken lances gave way to swords. Blunted swords gave way to maces. Some temple knights, weapons lost, beat fleeing men down with helmets and bare iron. The ground turned slick beneath us. Those ravines filled layer by layer, dead cushioning dying, dying crushed beneath more dead. The king's vision had been exact. The land itself became our weapon. The dead piled on top of the dying, and the dying were crushed, unable to breathe, buried under more bodies still falling into the ravines. In some places, those channels filled so completely that men tried to run across them, over bridges made of flesh and armor. To this day, scholars argue over what happened next. How did a few hundred exhausted knights keep up the pursuit for nearly 2 hours? How did horses that should have dropped dead from the march somehow outrun fresh enemy cavalry? No equation explains it. No manual accounts for it. The Christian writers had an answer. They said strength not their own carried them forward. What's chilling is that the Muslim chroniclers, horrified, agreed. They called it punishment from heaven. One respected historian wrote that God had turned his face away from them that afternoon. As the sun slid lower, the records turned dark. The chase didn't end because mercy was shown. It ended because our horses finally gave out. Their hearts, massive and loyal, simply failed after carrying men through what should never have been possible. The king never stopped. He fought through pain no words can properly describe. Later, knights swore they saw streaks of blood seeping from beneath his silver mask, as if his body itself were weeping. And still, his voice held, steady, commanding, guiding the killing with a clarity no one should have possessed in that condition. By late afternoon, the land for miles was carpeted with bodies. Ravines were choked so deep that weapons vanished beneath them. Broken swords, shields, and helmets lay scattered like seeds across the field. Once proud banners were ground into mud made of blood and dust. The numbers still stagger the mind. Of the enemy host that rose that morning, tens of thousands, only a few thousand survived to see nightfall. The losses on our side were heavy for such a small force, but nothing compared to the catastrophe inflicted on the other army. And the spoils? They were beyond counting. That army had marched heavy with wealth, coin, weapons, horses, supplies meant to sustain a long campaign. In a single afternoon, it all changed hands. The military orders seized enough equipment to supply fortresses across the region. More importantly, the enemy's war chest was captured. Wagon after wagon of coin meant to pay soldiers who would never return. By sunset, a kingdom that had been nearly bankrupt stood solvent again. When the king finally allowed himself to be lifted from his horse, his body failed him completely. He collapsed at once. Men rushed to catch him, but he waved them back. There was one last thing to do. On that field of death, surrounded by fallen enemies, he led us in prayer. Voices hoarse with exhaustion and horror joined together. Not to us, Lord, not to us, but to your name be the glory. The sight was unreal. Blood-soaked warriors kneeling among tens of thousands of corpses. Even men hardened by years of war said it broke something inside them. The enemy commander escaped with his life, but little else. He reached his capital with only a handful of survivors. The fast camels saved him, but the image destroyed his authority. Leaders who flee on pack animals do not inspire devotion. As the sun set over that ruined field, the impossible hardened into history. The consequences were enormous. Power structures cracked. Allies questioned loyalties. Decades of careful influence shattered in a single afternoon. Later calculations would suggest it took many years for the defeated power to rebuild anything close to what was lost in a few brutal hours. For our side, the victory bought something priceless. Time. Time to rebuild walls. Time to strengthen castles. Time to send messages west and pray they were answered. Even the enemy's own historians couldn't hide the scale of disaster. One called it the worst calamity of that age. Another wrote only that heaven had turned away from them that day. The shock rippled outward. Through cities, through mosques, through belief itself. And the world was not the same afterward. If an army that large couldn't crush a few hundred Christians, what did that say about divine favor? That question spread faster than any army ever could. From great cities along the river to desert mosques far away, places of prayer filled with people searching for answers. Some blamed moral failure. Others whispered doubts they'd never allowed themselves before. Faith itself was shaken. Jerusalem, though, exploded with joy when the news arrived. Bells rang until ropes frayed. Voices carried through streets day and night. But behind thick stone walls, in a quiet royal chamber, the king lay broken. The battle had taken a terrible toll on what little strength his body had left. Physicians warned that he might not last the night. And yet, against every expectation, he did. When someone finally asked him how he'd found the strength to fight, he answered barely above a whisper. "Pain doesn't matter," he said, "when God asks for service." From that day forward, the great enemy commander changed. For nearly a decade after that blood-soaked autumn, he moved with caution. The man who once trusted numbers alone had learned something the hard way. Superiority on paper means nothing when facing men ready to die without hesitation. The captured wealth reshaped everything. Gold taken from the field funded defenses for years. New strongholds rose from bare rock. Old walls were thickened and reinforced. The military orders swelled with volunteers. Men drawn by the story of a victory that shouldn't have been possible. And the king? He ruled on. Year after year that should have killed him became another miracle. The boy who was never meant to reach adulthood commanded respect from enemies who outnumbered him beyond reason. By the end, his body was failing completely. He could no longer walk. His sight was gone. But his mind remained sharp, and his courage never cracked. When he finally died in the mid-1180s, still barely into his 20s, word reached even his greatest enemy. It said the conqueror admitted quietly that he feared that one sick king more than entire armies. The irony cuts deep. Only a short time after his death, the holy city fell. Without that fragile figure holding everything together, the Crusader states unraveled. The kingdom saved by a few hundred knights couldn't survive without the man who made them believe. When the final great defeat came years later, it was fought using lessons learned from that earlier disaster. Never underestimate desperate men. Never assume victory before steel meets steel. Never let confidence decay into carelessness. Even today, military schools study that battle, not for tactics alone, but for psychology. The king understood what his enemy missed. Morale outweighs mathematics. A few hundred men who believe heaven stands beside them can outweigh tens of thousands who hesitate. That was the leper king's true genius. Not clever maneuvers, not secret weapons, but the ability to make his soldiers believe that the impossible was not just possible, it was inevitable. The echo of that day carries through history. Whenever a hopeless stand succeeds against overwhelming odds, its shadow appears again. It reminds us that sometimes courage matters more than counting. And here's the part that still gives me pause. Both sides, victors and defeated alike, agreed that something beyond reason happened that day. How else do you explain exhausted horses outrunning fresh ones? A dying teenager outthinking one of history's greatest commanders? A few hundred men breaking an army that should have erased them? In the end, that battle stands as one of history's most astonishing moments. A brief instant when the impossible stepped into reality. When a handful of men held back the tide of history itself, if only for a moment. And sometimes, a moment is enough.